For the first talk, I have two warnings. The first one is, unfortunately, you will not be listening to Victor Longa, who couldn't be here due to a conflicting schedule. And the second thing is, as you have noted, I'm both the chair and the speaker. It's probably the first time that happens to me. So the risk of me running out of time is high because the chair will not disagree with me. And if a question is too hard, the chair will cancel it, okay, for the speaker. No, but seriously, I will try to just be as brief as I can. And I want to make two points in this presentation and the next that directly relate to some of the themes that were already touched on in the previous talks. And they both pertain to how the field of so-called biolinguistics emerged in the late 1950s and developed since then. And there are two figures, two important names that were involved in this process. The first one was Noam Chomsky, the second one Eric Lenneberg. And I'll try to give you two messages regarding their contributions to current state-of-the-art biolinguistics. The first one is that on the whole, I think it would have been good for the field to listen more to what Eric Lenneberg had to say, specifically in his publications. And the second message, which will be for the next talk, is that perhaps we shouldn't have taken for granted everything that Chomsky has said in the context of biolinguistics. And in fact, I think we could incorporate some of the early insights of Eric Lenneberg to kind of shift, I think, the paradigm for current biolinguistics in a more fruitful fashion. So let me tell you a little bit about Eric Lenneberg, his insights, and the sort of lessons that we could still draw from a book that goes back to the early 1960s. I mean, the book that Lenneberg is famous for is Biological Foundations of Language, published in 1967, but it's really a collection of work that Eric Lenneberg had been doing for about 10 years or so. And what he did is highlight a couple of things that I think we should really stress. The first one is already very clear in the 1964 publication, is that nothing, and nothing is in red for a particular reason, namely to be stressed, nothing is gained by labeling the propensity for language as biological unless we can use this insight for new research directions, unless more specific correlates can be uncovered. That is, it's not particularly interesting to talk about the biology of language if you don't invest a lot of, if you don't engage with the biology literature. That is, calling something the language faculty as a biological organ is not so interesting unless we are really, we really intend to provide details of what that organ is in biological terms. And already back in 1964, 1967, Lenneberg pointed out that in the context of language, biology has been badly neglected. Now, at the time that Lenneberg was writing this, he probably meant that there was a very strong behaviorist current in psychology that disregarded the biological input to actually construct a language or learn a language. But today we could say that even within the field of linguistics that's oriented towards biology, for example, the generative paradigm, if you want, biology is still badly neglected. It's still badly neglected because you see very few linguists engaging in detail with data from biology, with perspectives from biology. And you have seen this already in some presentations today. It's been corrected, I think, by today's speakers, but you've heard that, for example, the degree of variation across speakers, across individuals, across developments, is largely disregarded or idealized in the linguistics literature, even when that linguistic literature claims to be biologically oriented. So biology was badly neglected at the time of Lenneberg. It is still badly neglected, but perhaps in a different sense in the biolinguistics literature. And I think this, pursuing the sort of work that Lenneberg did, could actually be a way of remedying that situation. And so what I want to do now is go through certain quotes, passages from Lenneberg's landmark Biological Foundations of Language, and basically, in fact, the job will be very easy. I'll just give you the quotes, and you will be immediately able to relate those quotes to some of the mistakes that have been corrected in today's presentations. You will see that by and large, the linguistics literature, even that part of the literature oriented towards biology, has failed to take into account truths about biology that were already very clear and explicit in Lenneberg, but then were somehow forgotten. And so, like all classics, I think it's particularly good to go back to Lenneberg's book to just basically learn not so much new things, but also learn what we have forgotten and what we shouldn't have forgotten. One thing that's very clear, and again it connects to some of the talks that you've heard already, is that Lenneberg in 1967 already was well aware of the limitations of the so-called modern synthesis in biology. If you read through the book carefully, and you will see some passages later on in this talk, it's very clear that Lenneberg was pushing or arguing for an extended synthesis, even if he didn't use the term. He was aware that a genocentric view alluding to genetic blueprints, for example, in the context of language was misleading, was too limited. Okay? And unfortunately, the linguists have continued using metaphors like genetic blueprint for language or universal grammar, despite the fact that Lenneberg had told us this was a bad thing to do. Okay? And I will focus on two aspects of Lenneberg's message that I think are directly related to previous talks. One is the issue of development, and the other one is the issue of domain specificity, or the lack of domain specificity in the context of language. And this will also take me to the final talk of today. And you will see that in a certain sense, but not, I think, a fourth sense, in a real sense, Lenneberg's book was an early Evo-Devo book. I think it ought to occupy a space on the Evo-Devo literature shelf, very close to Stephen Jay Gould's Ontogeny and Phylogeny in 1977, where, you know, messages like calls for an extended synthesis were already present, and they were just ignored for 20 years. And I think Lenneberg's book fulfilled, you know, has a place in that prehistory or history of the field. The target of today, a target that Lenneberg didn't have, because this was a work published after his death, but I think one that he would have been surprised to encounter, is a point of view that Chomsky has articulated, but others perhaps more explicitly. For example, Steve Anderson and David Lightfoot in 2002 defined something like universal grammar, a concept that many of you must have heard of, as that part of our genetic endowment which is relevant for our linguistic development. And it looks like an innocent phrase as such, until one asks, and I think too often we don't ask this question, what exactly do we expect to find as part of this genetic endowment? Lenneberg was concerned with this, but Anderson and Lightfoot, I think, aren't particularly concerned with this. It's just a phrase that's used as basically something that's for others to figure out. All right? And I think this is particularly unfortunate if you say that your linguistics is oriented towards biology. If you say, well, the hard work, that's for the other guys. Okay? People like Neil Smith have expressed something similar, namely you hear more or less halfway through this quote, the universal properties of language have become encoded in the genes of the children. And this is great to read until you ask, but what are the genes such that they could encode such properties? Namely, so it's one thing to figure out what those properties are, but then it's another to ask, could the genes encode those properties? And usually the linguists don't care about this question, basically. They just are happy saying that, well, if it can't be taken from the environment, it must be in the genes. After all, that's the only thing we have. So let's just assume that they are encoded somehow in the genes. And if you ask them, well, how could they possibly be? Perhaps not in details, but how, as a starting point, they have, not only don't they have any idea, they don't seem to find the question even interesting. And I think this is unfortunate. So let's see what Lenneberg had to say about this issue back in 1967. Well, you get things like him saying, it's not strictly correct to speak of genes for long ears, for auditory acuity, or for the capacity for language. So directly saying that, well, Anderson, Lightfoot, Smith, they don't really know what they are talking about when they talk about grammatical properties really encoded in the genes. Because Lenneberg said it's not strictly correct to speak of genes. Genes can only affect ontogenesis through varying the cell's repertoire of differentiation, but this in turn may have secondary effects upon structure, function, capacities. Genes don't encode grammatical properties as such, okay? So, in other words, don't say that they do. Don't define universal grammar that way. Lenneberg went on saying, we don't know what the direct relationships are between man's complement of genes and his mode of communication. We merely wish to outline the theoretical possibilities for relating the two. But even though we don't know many of these things, a direct and profound dependence of language capacity on genetic constitution exists, but it's important to highlight that it's possible to talk about language in connection with genetics without having to make shaky assumptions about genes for language, okay? And that's where Lenneberg wrote that there is no need indeed to assume genes for language. That is, you don't have to do the following, which is very common among linguists. If it's not environment, it's in the genes. Lenneberg is saying, actually, you don't have to necessarily make that shaky assumption about genes encoding grammatical properties, even if you can't derive those properties from the environment. You just have to recognize that the work is actually harder than you thought. The central nervous system and other tissues in the body develop simultaneously and influence one another continuously during morphogenesis, Lenneberg said. And here I think is an important message that's often missed by linguists, is that you have to pay really attention to development. There is this idealization that's very recurrent in the field of generative linguistics that says language acquisition is basically instantaneous. Well, it's not. It's not instantaneous, and Lenneberg told us why. Because if you think that it's instantaneous, then you don't make room for development to affect the emergence of a particular language in a child's brain. And if it's not in the genes, and if it's not in the environment, maybe the developmental process is particularly important. But if you say it's instantaneous, you're basically arguing that you don't want to look at that particular issue. Okay. Lenneberg made this point about development being important in the context of the modern synthesis. Today, with Evo-Devo being like at the heart of biology, it's perhaps more difficult to imagine a time where development was ignored in biology. But biologists have learned a lesson. Linguists have not yet. Okay. And in fact, Lenneberg at one point in the book wrote, our proposal, namely taking development really seriously, is in a certain sense an epigenetic view on language that I think has been missing from the literature on biolinguistics. What you find still today in biolinguistics is largely a pre-formationist paradigm as opposed to an epigenetic one. And this is unfortunate because Lenneberg pointed out there was actually an alternative that we should explore. Okay? Right, I'll skip a couple of things. Yes. To then discuss another issue, namely that of domain specificity. Lenneberg was concerned not only with arguing that genes couldn't encode grammatical properties directly, and that development was important to understand, the gap between what the genes give you and what the environments give you. Lenneberg was also worried about positing mechanisms that were specifically designed for language, as opposed to more general cognitive capacities. And in fact, he stated that in the mechanisms of language, we find a natural extension of very general principles of organizations of behavior, which are biologically adapted to highly specific ethological function, namely, for example, verbal communication. But Lenneberg was very clear that the origin of those mechanisms for language can be traced back as extensions to very general principles of organizations, that is, to basically general cognitive mechanisms. And this is, again, a line of approach that's been disregarded or certainly made a minority in the field of biolinguistics today. And although the talks you've heard suggest that, well, perhaps we should go back to the insight that Lenneberg is expressing in this particular perspective. All right? Again, Lenneberg, in a different passage, made a point that I think we should really take to heart, namely this. In order to reconcile the experimental findings regarding the relationship between the cerebral cortex and behavior in animals, and to relate those findings to our clinical experience with man, it appears reasonable back then in 1967, to assume that complex species-specific behavior patterns, such as language, result partly through subcortical, highly centralized integrating mechanisms, and partly through the interactions of activities of the most rostral level. What Lenneberg is saying here is that when people think about language, and when they even think about language in brain terms, they always think of the cortical areas as being this most recent adaptation of the human brain as probably being the source for the linguistic mechanisms that are sui generis. But Lenneberg was already pointing out that perhaps some of those mechanisms can be traced back to subcortical areas and mechanisms that are, of course, in no way specific to man. They are indeed very general principles of the brains that perhaps suitably modified could actually give you, things that enter into language, but that don't have to be specified as something that is just for language. Okay? So here, Lenneberg was stressing that in general, it's not possible to assign any specific neuroanatomic structure to the capacity for language. If you've listened to the first talk today by Benitez Buraco, you must have seen that it's very difficult to actually define what's the linguistic circuit that's common across individuals that have a language faculty. Well, Lenneberg was already making this point. It's not possible to define a particular area as being devoted to language. That's just not how the brain works. That's also not how evolution works. This is a point that was completely missed, it seems, in the intervening 40 years, and that perhaps today we are trying to recapture with difficulty. Okay? And Lenneberg stressed that language, therefore, if it's not possible to, assign a particular area to language, language is probably due to the peculiar way in which the various parts of the brain work together, or in other words, to a particular function. That is, perhaps what we call language in the brain is nothing but a nice integration of different mechanisms that are much more general in nature. And this is a point of view that hasn't really been part of, if you want, the canonical work or perspective in biolinguistics, but it seems to be one that's much better informed by how the brain works and how evolution works. And so this is a lesson that we should take to heart. Naive notions like genes for language, or universal grammar is basically a genetic blueprint, or language brain areas, should be avoided, since a little specializations both at the genetic and neuroanatomical level is expected. Lenneberg told us that. We seem to have either forgotten or just not listened in the first place. Okay? It may well be the case that the structural and organizational principles underlying language are not unique to humans, nor to language, and that homologs exist in other animals. So in other words, we should engage in a comparison with other species. Doesn't mean that they have language as a whole, but they might have lots of interesting components that enter into language. The emergence of language may be the result of perturbation that affected a developmental system that in itself goes way back in evolutionary time, and it simply created new developmental pathways favoring, eventually what becomes the language faculty. But notice here again, we should stress a developmental factor. It's not directly encoded in the genes, and it may not be, again, specific to language. So with these questions, I think Lenneberg was giving us a program for biolinguistics. Not only that, he was giving us an Evo-Devo program for biolinguistics. This was a program that was available in 1967 and that linguists decided not to exploit since then, even though they continued to say that what they were doing was basically studying the biological foundations of language, without basically being critical about what those foundations could look like. Well, it turned out Lenneberg told us what they could look like. And I think that what we have learned in the intervening years, at least from the biology literature, is that Lenneberg was basically right. In fact, he was ahead of his time because the biologists of the modern synthesis at the time Lenneberg was writing would have said, no, wait, the genes, of course, are important. Development we can actually ignore. They were basically making a point that was very familiar and still very familiar in the linguistics literature. But Lenneberg was said, no, not that. And this program is perhaps the one that we should take as a starting point to really try to engage with the biology literature, engage with Evo-Devo, and hopefully then shed light on what many still call the language organ. But it will be quite different from what the linguists seem to suggest in their writings. In fact, it will probably be along the lines of what Lenneberg would have discovered had he lived after writing his 1967 book. So on this note, thanks for listening to the first presentation.